So if you want to wrap up conversation, we want to make sure Kim has enough time to speak to all you, and you have a lot of questions armed, I assume. So I see a lot of new faces here tonight. Welcome. My name is Lauren O'Neill. I'm Orrick's Director of Startup and Venture Relationships, and for those of you who don't know what Orrick is, no, we are not a vacuum company. We are a global corporate law firm focusing on technology, energy and infrastructure, and finance. As Director of Startup and Venture Relationships, I work closely with our technology companies group, a fantastic group of attorneys globally, focusing primarily in the market on early stage startups, founding teams, VCs. I run an interesting series called Total Access, which some of you may be familiar with. It's an entrepreneur series, started about 7 years ago. We talk about all sorts of cool tactical stuff. Steer clear of the legal talk for the most part, but incredibly valuable nonetheless. An interesting part of my role and my colleague Neil Lalani's role is that we're in the market working with founders, founding teams on fundraising strategy, making thoughtful connections to VCs. So if you want to learn more about that specifically, please do feel free to grab my ear later and ask a lot of questions tonight. So thank you again for coming out. I'm going to turn it over to Claire and the SVB team, who will then turn it over to Kim. Thank you again, and happy holidays.
Thank you. Is this on? Hi. Welcome, everybody. We are delighted to have a fantastic, esteemed author here at our partner office at Orrick. Thanks for coming out. It's not actually that gloomy outside at the moment. I just noticed the beautiful colors in the sky. So we're gonna keep going, I think, until about 6:30, and then we hope you'll stick around. So a bit about this evening. Kim's going to do her talk, and then it's going to be interactive Q&A. So it's really not about, death by PowerPoint and you just listening to somebody. We do want to have a conversation and have a dialogue about Candor. So I was fascinated when I first met Kim, actually at Sarah Lacey's house, and we had this incredible group of women, female leaders around for dinner, and the discussion was just amazing and so full of candor. And as an Irish woman in the Valley, I can really identify with that. So I was instantly drawn to Kim and her story and the incredible motivation that Kim really holds for, telling a story and telling the truth and telling it in a way that obviously shows that you care and you're more effective in your communication. And so for someone who cares passionately about communicating well and also kind of moving at a very fast pace to get a lot done, I was very conscious of the message. So thank you to Kim, who's graciously giving up her precious time to talk to us. And I will say, Amazon is usually incredible, but I've just been informed by my team that the books did not arrive. They've actually gone missing. They are officially lost. It's possible that Santa's stolen them so that he can give them to someone else. I don't know. I mean, it's a mystery. But when we kind of find the books, Radical Candor by Kim, in the Bermuda Triangle of San Francisco mail offices, what we're going to do is we have all of your email addresses. Orrick is going to get in touch and make sure that we get a signed copy of the book mailed to you when it does potentially arrive, show up. Oh well, the best laid plans. So without further ado, I'd love to turn it over to Kim to talk to us a bit about Radical Candor. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for taking time tonight to come here. Thanks so much to Silicon Valley Bank and also to Orrick for making this happen tonight. It was such a fun dinner and auspicious in many ways, including this. And if you can't wait to get the book, you can go to Amazon and buy it and get $5 off. 5 Rad Candor. 5 Rad Candor, I think you type in or something when you check out. So anyway, I'm sorry that the books aren't here. But we are, so we're going to have a great time. What I want to talk to you about is a really simple idea. And if you can put it into practice, it will help each and every one of you, yourselves, and build teams that do the very best work of your lives. But even more importantly, from my perspective, it'll help you build the best relationships of your career. And what I want to do to start by explaining it is just tell you a simple story about a time when my boss criticized me. I had just started working at Google, and I had to give a presentation to the founders and the CEO, and I walked in the room, and there is Eric Schmidt with his head like plugged into his computer. It's like he's so deep in his email, I'll never get his attention. And there's Sergey on an elliptical trainer in toe shoes in the corner of the room. And so I wonder, how am I going to, what's my role here? How do I get these people to listen to me? And like any normal person, I felt a little bit nervous. But luckily, the business that I was leading was on fire. And when I said how many new publishers we had added for the AdSense business, Eric's head pops up out of his computer, and he says, "What did you say?" And I repeated the number. And he said, "What do you need? Do you need more engineers? Do you need more marketing dollars?" So I'm feeling like the meeting went okay. In fact, I'm feeling like a genius. And then as I'm leaving the meeting and walking out the door, I pass by my boss, who is Sheryl Sandberg, and I'm expecting a high five, a pat on the shoulder. And instead, she says to me, "Why don't you walk back to my office with me?" And I think, oh boy, I've screwed something up, and I'm sure I'm about to hear what it was. And Sheryl started by telling me about the things that had gone well in the meeting, not in a feedback. Am I allowed to curse? I forgot to ask. Not in a shit sandwich kind of way, but really telling me stuff I didn't know. But of course, all I really wanted to hear about was what I had screwed up. And eventually, Sheryl said to me, "You said a lot in there. Were you aware of it?" And I sort of made this brush-off gesture, and I said, "Well, it's no big deal. It's a verbal tic, really." And she said, "You know, I know a really good coach, and Google would pay for it. Do you want an introduction?" And I kind of made this gesture again. I said, "No, I'm busy. Didn't you hear about all those customers?" And then Sheryl stopped. She looked right at me, and she said, "I can tell when you do that thing with your hand that I'm going to have to be a lot more direct with you. When you say every third word, it makes you sound stupid." Now, she has my full attention. And some people would say that it was mean of Sheryl to tell me that I sounded stupid, but in fact, it was the very kindest thing she could possibly have done for me in that moment. Because if she hadn't said it to me just that way, and by the way, she wouldn't have said it like that to anybody else on her team, but I was maybe a little more stubborn than most. If she hadn't said it to me just that way, I wouldn't have gone to see the speech coach, and I wouldn't have had one of life's least pleasant experiences, watching myself on videotape and realizing that Sheryl was not exaggerating. I literally said every third word. And the strange thing about that was I had been giving presentations my whole career. I had raised millions and millions of dollars for startups giving presentations. I thought I was really good at it. And this got me to thinking, why had nobody told me? It was as though I had been going through my entire career with my fly down, and nobody had had the common courtesy to tell me. And so I started thinking about why had nobody told me, and what was it about Sheryl that made it so seemingly easy for her to tell me. And I realized, in the case of Sheryl, it really boiled down to two things. Sheryl cared personally about everybody who worked directly for her. I mean, she led an organization of 5,000 people, so she couldn't have a deep personal relationship with every one of them. Relationships don't scale. But with her direct reports and the people who she worked especially closely with, she cared about them at a personal level. So when I took the job at Google, moved from New York to California, and didn't really know anybody, Sheryl, knowing that I was lonely, invited me to join her book group. And that was the kind of thing she did for everyone who worked for her. When a family member fell ill and I had to get on a plane and leave, Sheryl called me and said, "I have you covered. I have you covered. You stay there as long as you need. Don't bother with a coverage plan. I've done it. And don't count it as your vacation time either. You need to be with your family. That's your priority." And again, this was the sort of thing she did for everybody who worked for her, not just for me. So she cared about us all, not just as employees, but as human beings. But she never let her concern for our short-term feelings get in the way of telling us stuff that we needed to hear. So she never hesitated to challenge directly. Now, I spent 1 summer at McKinsey and 2 years at business school, and I learned one thing in that period of time. All of life's problems can be boiled down to a good 2x2 framework. So here's my 2x2 framework. The thing that Cheryl did, caring personally and challenging directly, was what made radical candor. But how could I break this down? How could I operationalize Cheryl? So let's take it one axis at a time. First, care personally. This is what I think of as the give a damn dimension of radical candor. Now, what is it that moves us down on this dimension? Nobody starts out their career thinking, I don't give a crap about people, so I'm going to be a great boss. Like, that's not how it works. So what is it? Sometimes, of course, you're busy or whatever, but I think there's actually something more fundamental at play here. I think what happens is, along around the time we're 18 years old, 19, 20, we get our first job. We're right at that moment in our lives when our egos are especially fragile, but our personas are beginning to solidify. And right at that moment, somebody comes along and says, be professional. And for an awful lot of us, that gets translated to mean leave your emotions, leave your real identity, leave your humanity, leave everything that's best about you at home, and come to work like some kind of robot. And you can't possibly care about others as a robot. You have to be a full human being. So you've got to be more than just professional. You've got to learn how to bring your whole self to work. Not your worst self to work, not your most obnoxious self, your whole self, your best self to work. Now, what is so dangerous about this word professional? It doesn't sound like such a dangerous word. The problem is you're on a slippery slope when you're just professional, because we all have this bit in our brains where we view the world as either friends or foes. And if somebody is not a friend, they're almost automatically a foe. So when you're just professional, you're sort of moving towards apathy, and then you're moving towards something even worse, pseudo-speciation. This is a word that Erik Erikson coined to explain the truly terrible things like genocide. And I don't mean to exaggerate here. Office politics are not that bad. But have you ever noticed how the team who is further away is somehow stupider and less moral than your own team, right? There's this strange inverse correlation between distance, intelligence, and morality. And we all know that's not true, and yet we start to behave that way. So what you want to do is you want to be more than professional. At the very least, you want to give a damn about the people who you work with. And when you're really lucky, you actually love them. Not love in the sort of sense of the word we're reading about right now, but true love, not sex, but good professional love. Sometimes you do fall in love at work. That's another matter. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about real collaboration. So that is what makes often work worthwhile. That's what gives work meaning, are the relationships. We spend more time at work than we do in any other part of our life. So we may as well have real, meaningful relationships at work. Unfortunately, however, the Beatles got it wrong. Love is not all you need. You also need this other dimension of radical candor, the challenge directly dimension. This is what I think of as the willing to piss people off dimension of radical candor. Colin Powell said, and I think he's exactly right, that leadership is often about the willingness to piss people off. So why are we reluctant to piss each other off? I think this begins not when we're 18 years old, but when we're 18 months old. How many of you had a parent who said to you some version of, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it at all, right? Yeah, very common. The problem here is now it is your job to say it. And that is hard. It's really hard to undo training that's been pounded into your head since you learned to speak. So that is why it is not only hard, but it is your obligation It is your obligation to be radically candid with the people who you work with, because they don't see mistakes they're making often unless you tell them about them. And that is also why radical candor is hard. It's hard because of training that we've had since we were 18 months old, training we've had since we were 18 years old. One of the things that I've done to try to make radical candor a little bit easier is to name what happens when we fail on one dimension or the other very precisely. So when you fail to show you care personally about somebody, but you do challenge them directly, I call that obnoxious aggression. Now, when I first started doing this talk, I just called this the asshole quadrant, which seemed more straightforward. But I stopped doing that for a very specific reason. The reason was, as soon as I did that, people started writing names in boxes. And I beg of you, do not use this framework that way. These terms are not meant as judgments to hang around other people's necks or ways to sort of self-flagellate. Don't use this framework to judge other people or yourself. Use this framework more like a compass to help guide you in the right direction when you're having a conversation with somebody. Sometimes we fail on both dimensions at the same time. Sometimes we fail to challenge and we fail to care personally. And this is what I call manipulative insincerity. This is passive-aggressive behavior. This is backstabbing behavior. This is political behavior. This is what happens, and this is also just the false apology. We all are guilty of this. I'll describe my own hero's journey to manipulative insincerity in a moment. So we all do this from time to time. But the quadrant where by far the most mistakes get made most frequently is when we do care personally, when we are concerned about somebody else's feelings, and for that reason we fail to challenge them. And this is what I call ruinous empathy. And I'll describe probably the worst moment of my career to explain what I mean by that in a moment. But first I want to just go around all the quadrants one more time and tell you a couple of stories, quick stories, just to explain what I mean by each of these terms. So, radical candor, you already got the story, but I want to explain the origin story of radical candor, because a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that if they just hang out in ruinous empathy for a while and build a relationship, then it'll be easier to move over to radical candor. And that's not how it works. The seeds of trust get sown in radical candor. Another mistake that people often make is they think radical candor has to take forever. I got an email recently from a journalist who said, how long do these radical candor conversations have to take? And the answer is 2 minutes, usually. These are not sort of 2-hour-long therapy sessions. In fact, for me, the origin story of radical candor happened in the space of time it took a light to change in Manhattan. I was doing this startup in New York. I had this puppy named Belvedere, golden retriever puppy, and I adored Belvedere. And because I loved her so much, I never said a cross word to her, and she was totally out of control. And I was walking down the street one night, and she jumped in front of a cab. I pulled her out of the way just before she got hit. And this man, a perfect stranger, looked at me, and he said, I can see you really love that dog. That's all he had to do to move up on the care personally dimension. He didn't have to know my kids' names or my birthday or take me out for lunch or anything like that. I can see you really love that dog. But then he says to me, but you're going to kill that dog if you don't teach it to sit. And I sort of looked up at him, and he points at the ground, kind of this harsh gesture, and he says, sit! The dog sat. I had no idea the dog even knew what it meant. How did that happen? I said, how'd you do that? And he looks back at me and he says, it's not mean, it's clear. And he walked off, the light changed, and he left me with words to live by. It's not mean, it's clear, right? Such an important life lesson for me. Changed my whole management philosophy. So that's radical candor. Next, obnoxious aggression. So I will assert for the record that I am not, in general, an asshole. but I do sometimes behave like one. So here's one example, just one. I also did some research. I also have learned that all of you occasionally sometimes also behave like jerks. We all do. And so anyway, what happened in this story, again, shortly after I joined Google, it's astounding they let me stay there as long as they did. I got into an argument with Larry Page about an AdSense policy. And I sent an email to him and about 30 other people that said, Larry claims he wants to organize all the world's information, but if it'll make us a buck, he's willing to create clutter sites that muddle the world's information. Not my most politically astute move, okay? So why did I do that? Why did I do that? It's worth exploring for a second. I think the reason I did that was that I believe, as I bet a lot of you do as well, probably all of you, that there's a special place in hell for people who kiss up and kick down. But that doesn't mean doing the opposite makes tons of sense either, right? Caring personally is something that you owe to everybody you work with, whether you're the founder of the company where you're working or the intern who hasn't graduated from college yet. You've got to, this is common human decency is something that you can show to every single human being who you work with. But all too often, we treat our bosses like tyrants to be toppled, we treat our peers like enemy combatants, and we treat our employees like pawns on a chessboard. So fight that tendency. Now, the real problem with that incident was not actually sending the email. I learned later, actually, that Larry thought it was pretty funny. But I didn't know that at the time. A friend called me and said, why'd you do that? I said, why did I do that? And the real problem came with the cover-up. The cover-up is always worse than the crime. We see it over and over. The real problem came what I did next. What I did next was instead of, when I realized I had made a mistake, instead of moving the right direction on the care personally dimension, I moved the wrong direction on the challenge directly dimension. And the next time I saw Larry, I said, oh, Larry, I'm really sorry about that email. I realize now that I'm wrong, you're right. Two problems with saying that. The first problem was that I was lying. I didn't actually think that I was wrong and he was right. And the second problem was that he's got a pretty good BS meter, and he knew I was lying. He kind of looked at me like I was a pigeon that pooped on his shoulder and stomped off. The guy next to me said he likes it better when you disagree with him, actually. So, but this is a very common path to manipulative insincerity. As we realize we've made a mistake, we realize we've been a jerk, and instead of moving up on the care personally dimension and saying, I'm sorry, my email was obnoxious, I moved the wrong way, and I said, I'm sorry I said what I said, and I don't believe it, but I did believe it. So you don't back off your challenge if you still feel that way. So those are a few stories, but I want to sort of pause for a moment on ruinous empathy, because this is where most of you will make the vast majority of your mistakes. And to explain what I mean by ruinous empathy, I'm going to tell you a story about the worst moment in my professional career. I had hired this guy, we'll call him Bob. And I really liked Bob a lot. He was smart, he was charming, he was funny. He did stuff like, we were at one of those manager offsites that is endless, and we were playing some stupid get-to-know-you game that was going to take like 2 hours. And everybody hated it, but nobody really wanted to admit that they hated it. And Bob raised his hand and he said, you know, I've got an idea, and it'll be really fast, and we'll get out of here a couple of hours sooner. And we were all, whatever it was, we were going to do it. And he said, let's just go around the table and confess to one another what candy our parents used when potty training us. Weird, but fast. And then, weirder yet, everybody remembered. And then for the next 10 months, every time there was a tense moment in a meeting, Bob would whip out just the right piece of candy for the right person at the right moment. So anyway, we found this charming, weird but charming, and we liked Bob. Only one problem with Bob. He was doing terrible work. Absolutely, he would hand stuff into me and there was shame in his eyes. I couldn't understand what was happening because he had this amazing resume I learned later the problem was he was smoking pot in the bathroom 2 or 3 times a day, so maybe explained all that candy. But anyway, I didn't know any of that at the time. All I knew was that Bob was doing a bad job. And so but I liked Bob. I didn't want to hurt Bob's feelings. And so when he would hand this stuff in to me, I'd say, Bob, you're so smart. You're so awesome. We all love you. This is a great start. Maybe you could just make it a little better. Of course, he never did. All his colleagues had to go redo his work, fix his mistakes. And after about 10 months of this, the inevitable happened. And I realized that if I didn't fire Bob, I was going to lose half my team. And so I sat down to have a conversation with Bob, which I should have begun 10 months previously. And when I had finished, Bob sort of pushed his chair back from the table. He looked me right in the eye, and he said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And as that question is going around in my head with no good answer, he said, "Why didn't anyone tell me? I thought you all cared about me." And now I realized that I had failed Bob in 6 very important ways. First of all, I had failed to ask him what was going well from his perspective. And worse than that, I had failed to solicit criticism from Bob. Maybe I was doing something that was driving him so crazy he was forced to toke up in the bathroom. I don't know, and I never will, because I didn't ask him. I also failed to give him praise that was meaningful. The kind of praise that I gave him was really just a lie. It was really just a head fake and sort of an emotional salve. And frankly, part of that false praise was not just ruinous empathy. There was also a hint of manipulative insincerity in it, too, because everybody liked Bob. I was afraid if I upset Bob, he would start to cry or something in the office, and everybody would think I was a big bitch. And I didn't want that to happen, right? So I gave him sort of head fake praise, and I failed to tell him when his work wasn't nearly good enough. And probably worst of all, I failed to create the kind of environment in which everyone would tell Bob what was really good about what he was doing and when he was going off the rails. And because I had failed in all these different ways, I'm now firing Bob because of it. And it was too late to save Bob. At this point, even Bob agreed he needed to go. All I could do in the moment was make myself a really solemn promise that I would never make that mistake again, and that I would do everything in my power to help other people avoid making that mistake. And that is why I spent so much time coming up with a simple 2x2, because I hope that you all can use it in your day-to-day interactions to move in the right direction, to avoid any of these bad quadrants. So what I want to do now is pause and talk to you all, get some radical candor on radical candor, take some questions for about 10 minutes, and then I'm going to talk about some specific things that you can do. There was a microphone there, but it seems to have disappeared. Cool.
So did Bob ever list you as a reference, and how did you respond?
So Bob did not list me as a reference. You know, I think that in fact, he was very careful to tell me about his next job after he had been working there for a couple of weeks, and because I knew the people, but I didn't feel like it would be appropriate or necessary to call them and warn them about his pot smoking habit. But I did talk to him about it, and I think he got things under control. If he had listed me as a reference, I probably would have asked him not to, though.
Kim, thanks so much. That talk was tremendous. My question is there a recommendation you have for creating an environment by which the folks that you're being so candid with accept the candidness the candor in a way that is helpful to them rather than get upset, offended, etc.?
Yes. Unfortunately, there's good news and there's bad news here. Unfortunately, I don't have emotional Novocaine. Radical Candor does not come with some kind of salve that you can rub so that people, because especially when you're giving people critical feedback, it's going to sting a little bit. And it's unpredictable how they're going to react. And so there are some things you can do that might help, but I won't promise you that you'll never get a bad reaction. I'll talk more about this in the second half, but the short version is make sure you solicit feedback before you give it. Don't dish it out till you prove you can take it, till you show that you view it as a gift. Focus on the good stuff. Give more praise than criticism. There's a fine line between that and the feedback sandwich that I talked about earlier, and I'll go into that in more depth. And create an environment of self-criticism and people giving each other feedback. If all the burden of giving feedback falls on your shoulders, you'll get crushed. You need to create an environment in which everybody is offering this to one another. So I think those things can help a lot, and I'll go into more tips afterwards. But the other observation I would have on Radical Candor is that 9 times out, I mean, I don't have data. I'm working on getting this data, but here's just a swag. 9 times out of 10, it'll go way better than you expect. I got an email recently from this guy who had been an engineer at a big company. He had gone to this startup, and one of the engineers on his team at the big company called and said, would you interview me for this startup? And he didn't want to hire this guy because he was a little bit of a prima donna in terms of choosing what projects he worked on and didn't work on. And there was no room for that at the startup. People just had to roll their sleeves up and get stuff done. But he didn't really want to tell the guy this. But we had just had a conversation about Radical Candor. And he said, okay, I'm going to tell him. And he sort of took a deep breath. He was expecting the worst. And he told him, you know, ready for a punch in the nose or something. And the guy said to him, that was even more valuable than giving me a job. He said, I've known something was wrong. I didn't know quite what it was. Nobody would tell me. Thank you. So you'll more often than you imagine get a positive reaction. However, when you get a negative, when it is bad, it is very, very bad. Like the negative reactions can be incredibly painful. And my advice when you do get a bad reaction is to react to the emotion with compassion. Just eliminate the words, don't take it personally, from your vocabulary, because we do take it personally. Again, we spend more time at work than in any other part of our lives. And when we screw up, it sometimes feels like a punch to the gut. And so react with passion when somebody is upset about the feedback. Often what happens is, I'll be coaching people and they'll prepare to give feedback, and then the person that they're criticizing gets upset. Maybe they start to cry, or start to yell, or whatever, and they feel like they have failed giving the feedback. It doesn't mean you failed. You have failed because the other person is upset. It means the other person is upset. Attend to their emotions. Don't attend to your feeling of failure because they're upset. Right? There's a complicated, sometimes like the Verrazano State Bridge, you know, that your emotions about their emotions go critical. So don't let that happen. Just try to stay calm. Does that help a little bit? We got a couple of questions. One in the middle. Oh, we got one here. Hi.
Hi. First of all, thank you. I think these are really valuable observations and synthesis.
Thank you.
Were you able to put together a process that applied to across the vertical of the company, and how effective, and were there people who just didn't fit in, and how do you identify those?
Yeah. So I wouldn't say it's more of a mindset than a process. Although I will give you some process suggestions in the second half. And Radical Candor, often I talk about it boss to employee, because that was kind of the entry point where I felt like I would have the most leverage. But it's the same up, down, and sideways. It's the same between teams. the mentality and the things you have to do. It's the same when you have to be radically candid to your boss, and it's the same when you have to. And by the way, it also applies to your relationships outside of work. Like, I often give this talk, and the other day somebody ran up to me and said, "If only I had heard this 5 years ago, I wouldn't be divorced right now." So you can use it elsewhere as well. But anyway, I think that the important things are the same. It's making sure that you're soliciting feedback, that you understand the other person's perspective before you start sharing your own perspective, and making sure to focus on the positive rather than the negative. Then when you deliver the feedback, to make sure that you are focusing on being helpful, and I'll go through this in a little bit more detail, helpful and humble about it, that you're open to a reciprocal challenge. There are also some things you can do in terms of developing processes that will create a speak truth to power process. If you tell people feel free to speak truth to power, they don't feel free to speak truth to power. There's a very interesting case study about Johnson & Johnson's Credo. And the early Credo, the sort of credo in that got revised in the time of the Tylenol poisonings, said the company must have a process for employees to air complaints, grievances, feedback to management. And then the later credo said employees should feel free. And made a big difference. Like, employees didn't feel free, and you can see it in the products, unfortunately. So I think those things are really important. Am I kind of getting at what you were asking about, or did you mean something different?
Does it work employee to boss?
Yes, absolutely. It works.
Without the employee feeling intimidated?
Well, the employee will feel intimidated, and sometimes you'll have a disaster. Recently, I gave this talk, and somebody tweeted at me afterwards, "Tried radical candor on my boss, got fired." And I said, "Oh no, I'm so sorry. I know a lot of people. Maybe I could help you." And the guy said, "No, actually, I already found another job. I'm better off. Thank you." But so you're right. I mean, it is, your boss can fire you. I mean, that's one of the things your boss can do. So you do want to tread a little bit more carefully. But the other thing that I have found is that when I have a boss who's really pissing me off and I'm not saying anything, I'm going to wind up quitting for sure. In fact, I had one boss who was such a jerk. I didn't give him feedback. I literally shrunk, and as you can see, I'm not a tall person. I shrunk half an inch, and I don't have half an inch to give. And so it can really eat at you if you don't find a way to say productively what's bothering you to your boss. In fact, more than in any other relationship, if you can't explain what the other person is doing wrong so that they can fix it, either you're going to shrink half an inch, or people have insomnia around this, people break out in hives. Like, it takes a real physical toll. So I would say it's probably more important with your boss than with anybody else in your life, maybe with the exception of your spouse, to be radically candid. Yes? I'm letting the microphone decide, actually.
Yeah, so the stories you gave just for each quadrant, super helpful to let it actually sink in. Just curious, the one you gave for obnoxious aggression, that email you sent, if you could do that one over again, how would you have done that to move it into the upper right quadrant?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the first problem there was what Daniel Kahneman calls the substitution problem in thinking fast and thinking slow. So often when we're confronted with a really hard problem, something that's really hard to understand, we substitute an easy problem for the hard one. So in this case, understanding the AdSense algorithm was hard, but accusing Larry of being hypocritical and greedy was easy. And so I opted, we see a lot of that in our political discourse right now, right? There's these hard questions. And so I think the first thing that I would have done is spent a little bit more time trying to understand the AdSense, the hard problem. And if I had done that, I would have seen actually that Larry was right, and I wouldn't have had to send the email. If I couldn't understand it, I would have approached the problem with a little bit more humility. And if I really did think, after having done those things, that there was a problem of greed and hypocrisy, I would have talked privately to Larry about it rather than blasting an email. Does that make sense?
So
Couple more questions and then we'll, yeah?
I'll stand. I have the mic. This is really great stuff, Kim. And
Thank you.
I also worked at Google. And I have a little bit different take on that because I have to say I think Larry Page is not a normal person in terms of being, a leader who invites criticism. And I know as much as he wanted to make that part of the culture, it wasn't really that way. And my true experience is that the truth hurts. And so people don't, as my husband likes to say, the truth hurts. So when people are faced with the truth, because I'm a true proponent in radical candor, but I also have discovered that it does get you fired. So, if your boss is insecure for any reason, and there's a million reasons one could be insecure anywhere, and if they're just not willing to hear the truth or accept that it might be my truth, even if it differs with their opinion, then, you can basically, you're just a martyr, So other people are glad that you're saying the truth, and everybody else is just saying, oh my God, I'm so happy somebody else did it because she can get fired.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry to hear that, because it does sometimes happen that you're in a culture that is not as embracing of radical candor as you would hope. I mean, I think that there's one of the things that can really help is to approach this. I chose the words radical candor very consciously because there's not a lot of humility in the truth. And I think often when you go, especially if you have someone who you're working with who's insecure for any reason, if you go to them saying, I'm going to tell you the truth, what they hear, it's probably not what you mean, but what they hear is, I've got a pipeline to God, and you don't know shit from Shinola. And when people hear that, they kind of shut their ears down, and they resist it. So the reason why I call it candor is that, to me, candor is sort of saying, here's what I see. I'm curious to know what you see. Let's get on the same side of the table and see if we can work it out. And unfortunately, there are going to be times when either you can't work it out or it doesn't work out, and you've got to get another job, and that's hard. But it's not as hard as staying in the wrong job or staying working with someone who you disagree with. So I hope you found something that you love, and after that.
Hey,
Hey.
I have a question about maybe some other topics that are potentially covered in your book. You've talked a lot about guidance and giving praise and criticism, but I think as leaders and people in managerial positions, one of our jobs is to set expectations and set specific expectations. So if I say, a lot of job descriptions are very vague. We want an excellent shoe tire at our business. It doesn't say the bow needs to go in the middle.
Yeah.
So how do we start teaching leaders and managers to be able to set those expectations so that then from that conversation flows about what's going well and not? I'm curious if you lay out frameworks for that.
Yeah, I think that making expectations clear is it's something I talk about more in the achieving results part of the book. So what we're talking about today is the feedback part of the book. But when you are achieving results, a big part of what you're doing is listening and clarifying, and helping people. The sort of the theme of that part of the book is telling people what to do doesn't work. So sometimes one of the problems in setting expectations is you get lured down the path of dictating to people exactly what they do, and that's not going to work. But if you get people to tell you what they're going to do, and you push them to be as specific as possible, then these conversations become much, much more easy. But it's tricky. It took me a long time to realize that me being super clear wasn't always as helpful as dragging it out of them, getting other people to be clear about where they were going to put the bow. We need bows tied. Where do you think it should go? Maybe there's a better way to do it. Does that make sense? One more question, and then we'll.
I got one. So you said something at the very beginning, which kind of, I think, in a way, highlights my own personal challenge with Candor, which is that relationships don't scale. And so what I often find is that those that I have a relationship with, I'm more than willing to be radically candid with, but I tend to fall on the left side of the quadrant. What was it? Manipulatively stimulating?
Manipulative insincerity.
Insensitive, yeah. Manipulative, insensitive. And ruinously empathetic with folks that I don't have that investment with. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Is that right? Because what I find is, maybe it's something that happened to me when I was 18 months old. Like radical candor is exhausting, and it takes an investment, which I'm more than willing to make for those I have a relationship with, but relationships don't scale.
Yeah. So I believe that even when you're leading a big organization, you can't have a relationship with every single person. But the radical candor scales in one of two different ways. First of all, when you have these radically candid relationships with each of your direct reports, it makes it that much more likely that they have radically candid relationships with their direct reports, and that does scale. So that is kind of a big part of how culture forms, actually, is the relationships at the center. And then I always found, so here's an example of how I tried to scale radical candor with 100 people. I was leading when I first got to Google, leading the AdSense team, we would have these team meetings, 100 people once a week. And I would bring a stuffed monkey and a stuffed killer whale. And the stuffed monkey was Whoops the monkey. And I encouraged people to self-criticize, to share the biggest mistake they made that week. And the person who made the biggest mistake won the monkey for the week. And the deal was, you get, if you tell the story, you get instant forgiveness, and you help 100 people avoid your mistake. And it was a little bit hard at first to get people to tell these stories about themselves. I put $20 on Whoops' head, and it was amazing, the stories people, not because I think they were desperate for the $20, but it kind of gave them plausible deniability. All right, I'll play the game just to get, and I didn't have to always put $20, just the first few times. And then the killer whale was, you would tell stories, you would praise other people on the team, and you would tell stories about amazing things that other people had done. And so just little things like that can begin to build a culture of radical candor, where it's much easier to be open with a larger number of people. Another thing that I've seen done is Michael Deering, who, when he was at eBay, had this big orange box. And he put the big orange box near the bathrooms, and he told people, drop feedback for me in the orange box. It was locked, and he gave somebody else the key. And at our all-hands meeting, I will answer the feedback. So you can often answer criticism in a way that scales with a large number of people. You don't want to criticize people too harshly who you barely know, but if you see somebody making a mistake, just like the man on the street in Manhattan, it didn't take tons of energy for him to tell me that. It does take some emotional discipline, but you can do it in a way that actually makes people trust you. It's possible. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks, that's helpful.
Kind of? Do you kind of buy it?
No, I buy it.
Okay.
I mean, some of my conversations are, it's a little harder, right? If it's like why am I not getting that raise versus like well, I guess they're different, I suppose. So,
yeah, why am I not getting that raise? That's a conversation you should only have to have with your direct reports.
Yeah.
And then they should be having it with their direct reports. Yeah, you shouldn't have to have that conversation too often, but I get it. People come and ask you all the time. All right, shall we jump into things you can do, and then I can hang out for quite a while. I can hang out till about 7 if there's more questions. I'll get a glass of radical Candor juice at the break. So, yeah, then what happens? Then we'll see. The gloves will come off. Okay, so things you can do. It's all very well and good to share an idea, to talk about a philosophy, but nothing will change if you don't decide 1 or 2 or 3 little things you're actually going to do. So what I want to do is give you a few ideas. You don't have to do all this stuff, but choose tonight one thing you're going to do differently. Because if you don't, then you'll say, oh yeah, this radical Candor stuff is great, and then you'll go back to your desk and you'll keep doing the same thing you always do, I can promise. It's hard, radical Candor. It's free and it's fast, but it's still hard. Emotional discipline is hard. So I want to talk to you about soliciting it. Again, don't dish it out till you prove you can take it. So soliciting it, giving it, both praise and criticism, gauging it. Radical Candor gets measured not at your mouth, but at other people's ears. So you got to know how it landed for them. You may think you're being radically candid, but if the other person thinks you're being an asshole, you're being an asshole. And that's just the way it is, alas. And finally, ways you can encourage it, things you can do to encourage it across whole organizations and with other people. All right, so get it, soliciting radical candor. You want to solicit radical candor in your one-on-one, I think at the very end. One-on-one meetings the agenda should usually be set by the employee, almost always be set by the employee. But after your if you're having a one-on-one with an employee, but after they've gotten through all their items, then it's a good time for you to ask for some feedback. Another great time to ask for feedback is when someone is really mad at you. People will usually tell you what they really think if they're angry, but we all tend to try to avoid people who are mad at us, so don't do that. So you want to do it in your one-on-one. You want to have a go-to question. You want to have, if you just ask somebody, do you have any, in fact, I'll show you what will happen. Do you have any feedback for me on this presentation?
Going well so far?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I just put you on the spot and I learned a whole lot of nothing. So if we were in private, I won't do this to you now, but if we were in private, I would push you a little bit harder, right? So, and I would try to ask it differently. I wouldn't just say, do you have any feedback for me? Because I already know what the answer is. No! You've got to ask a question that really is going to drag stuff out of them. And you've got to ask a question that seems authentic. So one question that Fred Kaufman, who was my coach when I was at Google, suggested was, is there anything I could do or stop doing that would make it easier to work with me? Simple question. I liked it. I was talking to Krista Quarles, who's the CEO of OpenTable, about that, and she was like, I could never imagine those words coming out of my mouth. The question I like to ask is, tell me why I'm smoking crack. So there's a lot of different ways to ask. You got to ask. The way that I got to talk to Andy Grove, who was the CEO of Intel and sort of famous for getting people to tell him what they really thought. And I asked him, how did you do that? And he said, well, at the end of a one-on-one, I would ask somebody, I would say to somebody, there's one more thing. And he said, everybody knew that was code for, this is the most important thing to me. And then he would ask for feedback. And I was like, did you steal that one more thing from Steve Jobs? And he immediately got mad. He said, no, we both got it from Columbo, the detective show. So there's a lot of different places to get your go-to question. But you want to ask in a way that's likely to elicit some information. Now, having asked the question, your next step is to embrace the discomfort. People do not want to tell you anything. And so, but you can't let them off the hook. For a long time, I made the mistake of thinking if I just made people comfortable enough, then they would tell me the truth. But the only thing that's going to make people comfortable is not telling you the truth. So you've got to embrace the discomfort. Toyota, because the culture in Japan was such that people were very reluctant to criticize authority, decided that in order to have this system of continual improvement, what they had to do was paint a big red box at the end of the assembly line, ask people to stand in it at the end of their first week on the job, and not allow them to leave the box until they criticized 3 things they had seen on the line, right? So that's sort of an intense way to embrace the discomfort. I never had the nerve to paint a big red box around my desk. So what I learned to do instead was just shut my mouth, count to 6. I only just made it to 3, and you were all starting to fidget. You could hardly stand it. Almost nobody can endure 6 seconds of silence. So if you can keep your mouth shut for 6 seconds, odds are people will tell you something. And if that doesn't work, you can schedule a follow-up meeting, but don't let them off the hook. You've got to embrace the discomfort. Okay, so now you've dragged somebody out on a conversational limb that you didn't want to go out on. Your next job is to listen with the intent to understand, not to respond. It's so normal to get defensive when you hear feedback, especially if it's criticism. And when you're soliciting feedback, you're really soliciting criticism. You're not soliciting praise. Praise is going to come at you like a thick fog. So you're soliciting criticism. So of reaction, I think one of the things that is most helpful is just to respond back, just to state it back. Say, just to make sure I understand that just to make sure that I understand you correctly, here's what I heard you say. And then spout it back. Even if you totally disagree with it, it'd be hard to spout it, but just try to state it back. Make sure that you really understand what the person said. And last but not least, you've got to reward the candor. So it's not enough not to get defensive. You actually have to fix the problem if you agree with the feedback. And if you disagree with the feedback, rewarding the candor is a little bit harder. But the thing that I suggest is try to make sure that you take a couple of minutes to identify that 5% that you do agree with. You never disagree 100%. Find some area of agreement. And then say, let's follow up, let's have another conversation, and explain why you disagree. Sometimes a rational, respectful explanation of why you disagree is the best way to reward the candor. But don't just say, thank you for the feedback, because if you say, thank you for the feedback, the person hears you saying something totally different. And it's the last time you're going to get feedback from the person, all right? So next, giving. Both praise and everything I'm about to say applies to both praise and criticism. And there's a lot of work done on what's the right ratio to praise and criticism. Is it 2 to 1, the feedback sandwich? Is it 3 to 1? Is it 5 to 1? Is it 7 to 1? You can't really govern your conversations by a ratio, because if you do, you'll say ridiculous, insincere things like, I love those shoes. Your work is horrible, but nice purple jacket. I'm sure your work is great, but you'll wind up not giving good praise. So take the praise seriously. Give a lot of it. Give good praise. Don't try to run it by a ratio. And the best feedback I've ever gotten in my career has always happened in 2-minute impromptu conversations. Performance reviews and the like are really just a solidification and a formalization of these impromptu conversations that should be happening day in and day out, week in and week out. They don't have to take a lot of time. They don't have to add to your calendar clutter. The hardest thing about having these conversations is that you're finishing up a meeting, you've got to talk to somebody, you probably have to go to the bathroom, and you're probably late to your next meeting. So how do you choose between those competing priorities? So that's, you got to work out on your own. But take that 2 minutes, figure it out. Make sure that you offer the feedback humbly. You may be wrong. Feedback is a gift in one of 2 ways. It's a gift because you're giving the person the opportunity to fix a problem if they agree with you that it is a problem. But it also may be a gift because you're telling the person what you really think, and you're giving them an opportunity to disagree with you and convince you that you, in fact, are wrong. That's okay. It's okay if somebody disagrees with your feedback. In fact, it's good. You want to state your intention to be helpful. You're giving somebody feedback. If it's criticism, not to kick them in the shins, but to help them get better. You want to give people praise to help them do even more good work and to help the team do more good work. You want to give feedback right away. If you're helping somebody improve or helping somebody build on success, see, there's no reason to wait. You want to give the feedback in person. If Cheryl hadn't been talking to me in person, she wouldn't have seen me make this brush-off gesture with my hand, and she wouldn't have known that she had. You want to criticize in private, praise in public. And last but not least, not about personality. The purpose of praise and criticism is to help people change something, and it's really hard to change personality. So for the same reason you wouldn't say, the problem here is you're a moron, it's not really helpful to say, that's great, you're a genius. Like, anyway, it just doesn't help. So you want to be really specific about the feedback. Next, you want to gauge it. Again, you want to measure radical candor not at your mouth, but at the other person's ear. But it's hard to know what's going on in somebody else's ear. If you use this framework and just ask the person how your feedback landed, it's amazing how much a shared vocabulary can really help you get on the same page and sort of have a shortcut into these conversations. Because too much feedback on feedback begins to feel pretty tedious, right? So keep in mind about gauging radical candor that you probably fear being seen as a jerk, right? That's your fear. You're afraid of the obnoxious aggression quadrant. But the other person is probably most afraid that you're pulling your punches, that you're not actually saying what you mean. And as soon as you understand this dynamic, it becomes way easier to move over to radical candor. I saw that happen at Apple over and over and over again. When I was teaching there, Apple being Apple, they printed the framework up on these beautiful cardstock things, and they got hung around the office. And people would say, how did that feel for you? And they were stunned at how often they were worried they had been too harsh, and the other person was like, you didn't hit me hard enough. Hit me again, harder. So anyway, that was surprising for all of us and helpful. So last but not least, you want to encourage feedback between the other people who you work with. There are more other people than there are of you, so you'll have more leverage. You want to require clean escalation, and you also want to create, as I spoke about before, a speak truth to power process. So what is clean escalation? All I really mean by clean escalation is don't let people talk badly about each other to you. I had this guy working for me, Charlie, and I had this other guy, Daniel. They hated each other, and Charlie would come to me talking about Daniel. I thought I was Kissinger, a shuttle diplomat, and not just their boss. And so I would go to Daniel and I'd say, if you could just change these things, it'd be much easier to work with Charlie. Now Daniel's pissed because he knows Charlie has been talking to me. He pours poison in my ear about Charlie. I go running to Charlie saying, if you could just do this, this, and that. Now Charlie's pissed, knowing Daniel's talked badly about him to me. And then Daniel walks by my office wondering, I bet they're talking about me. And of course, he's right, we are. So all I've done, I was just trying to create peace, and all I did was stir the political pot. So don't do that. You ask people, did you talk to each other? Did you try to work it out? And if they didn't, insist they try. If they can't, make them come to you together, not separately. Very awkward at first, but it'll save you a lot of time. And be as fast and fair as possible. I was talking to one person who said to me, one CEO who said, oh yeah, when people can't work it out, I come up with the worst possible solution for both of them. That doesn't work. That didn't end very well. So anyway, don't do that. Last but not least, speak truth to power. Try having skip-level meetings. Basically, if you're a manager, talk to everybody, talk to the employees of the people who work for you without the person in the room. This sounds like it's contradicting the clean escalation, but if you're a manager of managers, people are reluctant to give their boss criticism. So you have to create a process that makes it more likely that they will. It can be a not for attribution meeting. You don't have to say who said what, but you do have to tell your direct report what was said in the meeting. Otherwise, they can't do anything. They can't do anything with it. Personality transplants are not available. You want to prioritize the issues, and you want to send notes at the end of the meeting to the person, and you want to require change. You want to make listening tangible. You want to make sure that people not only feel heard, but they see that there have been results of being heard. And with that, I'm going to take some more Q&A, and if people want to mingle, we'll do that. I think we're a little bit short of time, so we can do that for a little bit, and then we can get drinks, and I'll mingle a little bit. There's a question there. Thank you.
Hi there. So I'm from Instacart. It's a grocery delivery startup. And actually, for anyone who's a manager who's like hoping to like, I think there was a question. I just want to give a quick bit of advice before I actually ask a question on success. Our CEO talks, and I think it's because someone brought it up to him, and it's made it a lot easier for me to introduce it to the team. And he'll even say, I'm being candid right now. And I think our company knows this as a signal. But for myself as a manager, I have a question for you, which is when I first learned this process, I think I really was bordered on runic empathy for sure. And as you said, you start to feel a bit uncomfortable in moving into obnoxious aggression. And I think I have been rewarded in that some team members say like, no, I love this. This is great. Like, thank you. Or I pull them over for like rapid feedback in quick meetings. But I still have some who I've explained what radical candor is. We've talked about it, but they still see, I worry about their like mental health with like radical candor, to be honest.
Yeah.
I don't want to like beat them down. So like hearing that story, is there anything I might be doing wrong or advice you have?
Yeah, I don't think there's anything doing wrong per se, but I think the really important thing is when you see somebody is super discouraged by something you've said, and it seems like maybe they're overreacting. I think one of the things that can be most helpful is just to give voice, recognize the emotion. Say, I can see this is discouraging to you. My goal is not to discourage you. My goal is to help you improve. And then just ask that person, how can we have these conversations in a way that's better for you? Because it's an end-to-end problem. I say radical candor is universally human. I've never met a person who doesn't think love and truth are important in relationships. Both of those things are important. But how we interpret them is very different. So if you're gonna talk to me, if you're gonna be radically candid with me, you're gonna have to feel like you've picked up a 2x4 and hit me over the head, because I'm not apt to hear it. But if you're talking to my sister, you can be way gentler. You can be way, way gentler. And in fact, if you said it to her the way you said it to me, you'd probably crush her. And if you said it to me the way you said it to her, I wouldn't hear you at all. And this happens all the time. So you really have to adjust. It's universally human, but interpersonally relative. I wish I could give you like a formula, but the best thing you can do is just to ask that person, because it's going to be different person to person. It's also culturally relative. Radical candor in Tokyo sounds very different than radical candor in Tel Aviv. I learned that the hard way, managing teams in both places.
So I have a question. So in some ways, I think the opposite of radical candor is being conflict avoidant.
Yes.
And I think people are raised that way from birth. The person I'm thinking of is British and was told, if you're angry or unhappy, go to your room and come down later and have a nice cup of tea.
Yeah.
And as a manager, you can actually succeed by not dealing with controversial issues. You kind of put them in a virtual inbox, and a lot of them just go away.
Yeah.
So big teams can end up feeling, wow, this person is really easy to get along with, and they rise in the organization. And then occasionally, rarely, something really blows up. But that can be overweighed by all the issues that just went away, and you can be seen as a great manager. What do you think about that? What do you do if that person works for you or is a peer and kind of coasts along for years, rising with the occasional disaster
Yeah.
But there's so much, kind of virtual inbox
Yeah.
issues disappearing that it outweighs the disasters.
Yeah, I think that it is absolutely true that conflict avoidance doesn't blow up immediately. And it can work, but it's third best. So as I go around the quadrants, I think the style that gets the best results is radical candor, in my experience. Second best is obnoxious aggression. This I one time said, and it got tweeted out of context, and I look like a real jerk. I said, if you can't offer radical candor, second best thing you can do is be an asshole. But unfortunately, that's true. It's actually more effective. In fact, early in my career, I had just become CEO of this software company, and I got the same article emailed to me from about 10 different people. And the article was about how most people would rather have a boss who's really competent but a total asshole than one who is incompetent but really nice. And I thought, are they sending me this because they think I'm a jerk or because they think I'm incompetent? And surely those are not my two choices, right? But I think it is true. I mean, think about it in your own life. Would you rather have a boss who tells you where you stand? Or would you rather have that ruinously empathetic, sort of conflict-avoidant boss who leaves you to be a dead man walking for 5, 10 years? Like, that's where that's where sort of careers and quiet desperation get born, in that ruinous empathy. And sometimes, especially big companies, can survive ruinous empathy for quite a long time because they've got these resources and this momentum. But ultimately, you're not innovating. You're not doing the best work of your life in that quadrant. But you're right. I mean, you can survive. You can live a whole life that way without any disastrous impacts. It's kind of suboptimal. And then, of course, worst of all is manipulative insincerity. But in the growth of companies, I've noticed that one of the things that happens is when a startup is really small and it's succeeding, they tend to be radically candid. The founders tend to be pretty radically candid with each other, and the early employees tend to be pretty radically candid with each other. And then as it gets bigger, let's say succeeds, it grows to 400 or 500 people, and people don't really know each other that well, and they don't want to have a mean culture, and so people tend towards ruinous empathy, which doesn't work as well. It doesn't yield the same results. And then what happens is the assholes start to win because it's more effective than ruinous empathy. And then the rest of the people become manipulatively insincere to cope with the assholes, right? So, and that is the gravitational pull of organizational mediocrity right there, in my humble opinion, anyway.
How do you deal with somebody who accepts your feedback but doesn't fully make changes based on it?
Yeah, so the question is, how do you deal with someone who accepts the feedback, who doesn't disagree with it, but then doesn't reward your candor by changing things? I think one of the things you can do is ask them to send you, so what are you going to do about this? And again, pull it out of them. Ask them what they're going to do to change it. And sometimes you'll get a response that shows it looked like they heard the feedback, but they didn't actually understand the feedback. The other thing that happens over and over and over again, when I was leading a 700-person team at Google, it was like watching a slow-motion train wreck, because it happens so often where a new manager would come and say, I have this employee, and the employee is doing this thing, and it's really bad. And I would say, well, you've got to go tell the employee. I'd give my little radical candor spiel. And then I'd bump into the manager a few days later. I said, did you tell the employee about this terrible thing they're doing? Oh, yeah, I told them. I'm worried I upset them. I was really clear. You sure you're really clear? And then I'd bump into the employee, and I'll say, like, how about this issue? And they're like, well, what are you talking about? Didn't hear it at all. And so you be stunned that you think you've communicated and the person just hasn't heard you. Either because the person is super confident and they just block out feedback, or because you weren't clear enough. In my book, there's a little chapterlet on the perilous boundary between obnoxious aggression and radical candor. And I talk about this interview with Steve Jobs where the interviewer says, I hear you sometimes tell employees your work is shit. What do you mean by that? And Steve kind of laughs. He's like, what the hell do you think I meant? Their work is shit. And then the interviewer can't believe it. And then he keeps asking questions. And eventually, Steve sort of gives him a break and says, look, when you're working with people who are super confident, it's pretty hard to get through to them. Like sometimes you have to say extreme things. And you want to do it in a way that leaves no room for ambiguity, but shows them that you have confidence in their abilities. And that's a hard thing to do. And it is hard. It is hard. You just got to keep going. Good luck. It's not easy. You got to say it over and over and over again. Yeah?
Kind of a follow-up to that. What is then the balance between stating it and then stating it, but then telling them how to try to fix it in your way, as opposed to letting them understand how to fix it so it will work for them?
Yeah. So one of the techniques that is very commonly discussed that I find really helpful is situation behavior impact. So like when Cheryl was giving me the feedback, she said, in the meeting, when you said every third word, you sounded stupid. Like there's a big difference between saying that and Kim, you're stupid. World of difference. Much easier to hear. And because the thing about situation behavior impact is it lets me see exactly what the behavior is. And then she gave me a suggestion about how to change the behavior, go see the speech coach. But I could have come up with another, I don't know what I would have done, but maybe there's some other way to solve a speech defect. Maybe just being aware of it would have been enough, or I could have asked a friend to snap a rubber band every time I said or something. So I think that using that framework can really help. And then offering suggestions, but if the suggestions get rejected, insisting that the other person come up with opportunities. I don't think there's any point in pretending you don't have a suggestion if you do have one. Just say it, but don't insist on it. Does that make sense? Another question? Wow.
And I realized that I kind of was aggressive yesterday in one of the situations. We had a very small team. So I kind of fixed that by kind of doing something what you suggested in the book. My question for you is, when you are pretty small and you are remotely located, like you have 4 people and everybody is somewhere else, how do you really develop that personal sincerity toward each other that you have that depot, where you are radically candid, but it is still a taking care?
Yeah, so it's very hard. Managing remote teams, is that the bulk of, is that like at the crux of the problem is the remote team problem? So I think there's a couple of things you can do that help, because it's much harder. One of the things I found, I was pregnant with twins and managing teams in 10 different countries and unable to travel for months at a time. And so I really struggled with this. One of the things I found was having daily short meetings was more effective than a weekly 45-minute one-on-one, because you sort of started to get a sense of what was happening with a person on a day-to-day basis. The kinds of things you pick up just by walking past somebody's desk, you can pick up if you have a call with the person, and ideally a video call with the person that's short every day instead of one long meeting. I also found that there's a hierarchy of medium, that video's better than a phone call's better than email's better than a text, and just for the same reason you wouldn't break up over text, don't give feedback over text, right? You want to be able to see the 80% or at least of communication is nonverbal. And you can pick up on at least some of those cues over video. And you can even pick up on some of them over the phone, just through tone of voice. Much better than writing. All these feedback tools are a problem because they've got people typing their feedback into tools instead of just talking. I built a feedback tool and I realized it was a disaster. Like the whole point, I was trying to get people to like look each other in the eye, put their damn phone away, and talk to each other. And I was like, this app is a value subtracting round trip. Just stop it. So the more you can talk, the more you can travel and get together and get to know people, have meals with people, at least on a quarterly basis, the better, if that's possible. Does that help?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Yes.
How would you scale for what I call the autism dilemma of Silicon Valley? I mean, that's what you're calling to need the 2x4 and the hammer. But one of the only things I ever found was in the actual moment, and it's a difficult thing to say. You know that thing we fought about last week? That's what's happening right here and now.
Yeah. I think that's great. I mean, that's the whole idea of radical candor is
Right, but I'm on a flat plane hierarchy, so but how do you do that as a boss? I mean, I think the application is correct, but when you start layering in a hierarchy, it's almost the only way to get through, but I don't know how you put it on the hierarchical, that's complexity.
So just to make sure I understand the question, the problem.
When you're on a flat plane and you're trying to say, okay, I work with you every day. Remember that thing about you being a selfish asshole? You are doing it again right now, and let me explain, because you can't see it, so you have to catch it in the moment, right? We've all had that. But when it's your boss or your so-and-so, when you go into the vertical, it gets much more complicated, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. For some people, giving feedback to their peers and soliciting feedback from their peers is the hardest thing. For other people, it's really interesting. A lot of the questions I get, bosses are as afraid of their employees as employees are, maybe more afraid of their employees than the other way around. So it just depends on the person. I never had any trouble kicking up, as I told from my story, but it was very hard for me to be radically candid with my peers. So I think the key thing to success with radical candor is to try to eliminate hierarchy from your mind, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to form a relationship with someone. There's nothing more damaging to a relationship than hierarchy. So you take hierarchy out of your mind and you say, what I'm going to do is I'm going to solicit first, and then I'm going to offer it, right? And when I offer it, I'm going to focus on the good stuff. And when I get to criticism, so there's steps before, and this is true up, down, and sideways. When you get to the in-the-moment feedback, you want to make sure you're being humble and helpful and not criticizing personality and all that stuff. It's tempting to say, you are a, and use isms and stuff like that, but they don't really help. Does that make sense? Yeah. How are we on time? I don't have, my phone is in a hole behind that table, so I don't know what time it is. So how many more questions should I take? Okay.
Yeah, so I have a lot of friends or people I know who work at Google. And I've never worked at Google, but I've worked in companies that came from the Oracle lineage, so the obnoxious, aggressive. And if you look at Apple, Oracle, Microsoft, they all have the obnoxious, aggressive style. And I'm surprised to hear you espousing the more aggressive style, because everyone I've known from Google, they're all on the passive-aggressive side. Every single one. There's not a single one that comes in your face and tells you.
It's really interesting. Yeah, it may have been that I was early at Google and that it went through that cycle I described after I left. But I certainly, and obviously other people in the room had different experiences at Google. Here's what I would say. I would describe the culture at Apple as radically candid with a twist of obnoxious aggression, and sometimes a big twist. And I would describe the culture at Google as radically candid with a big twist of ruinous empathy. And maybe that twist has grown since I left, now a long time ago, 2010. But I think as companies grow, it's really hard to keep that radical candor alive. And they often move in one direction or another. I think you're right. Yeah?
So you made the comment about how these feedback tools, like you wouldn't recommend them, and I got them from my colleagues, so I feel like I should ask. So we implemented when like giving thanks via this email feedback tool with the rationale that we can track it better. And also we have this tendency with small companies for everyone to blast, congrats, thanks, and so then 30 emails.
Yeah, I know, that's terrible.
And so avoid that problem, and I definitely believe in encouraging like one-on-one feedback, but I wanted to have this be something that they could do more frequently than do like an all hands, that type of stuff. What do you think of that as being like one tool in a bigger?
Yeah, I shouldn't be so blank. I'm sure there are going to be some tools that are great, but I think that any tool that substitutes for people looking each other in the eye and talking to each other, any tool that takes time away from actual relationship building, I think, is not necessarily a step in the right direction in terms of feedback. But I certainly have seen systems like Gokul, who's a product manager, Gokul Rajram, who's a product manager I worked with at Google and then at Square, was really good about having this kudos document, and it was effective. But he also made a point of talking in person at his team meeting about what got submitted into the kudos doc and going to the person and saying thank you in person. So I think I'm sure there's a good way to use technology here, and I applaud you for experimenting with it, but just make sure it's not a substitute for actual human interaction. Does that make sense? One more, and then shall we drink?
So I was wondering if there are any hints that you have when we want to be concerned about diversity and inclusion with regards to application of radical candor?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked that question. It's really important, really, really important question. So radical candor is really hard with someone who looks just like you. It's even harder when someone looks different from you. And we're much more reluctant. So I'll talk about radical candor and gender, but just because I'm a woman. But I think a lot of these things apply to diversity writ large. So one of the things that I have found is that when a man is managing a woman, he's much more likely to pull his punches when giving her feedback. Not because he's a misogynist jerk or anything like that, but because he's been taught since he was a child to be gentler with women. And that is a big problem for women if you believe that feedback helps you grow. So my advice to women is to really work hard to drag feedback out of your boss if your boss is a man. And if you're a man managing a woman, my advice to you is man up and just give her the feedback. She can take it. So that's one dynamic that I see. Another dynamic that I see is that when I as a woman have been radically candid, I feel I get, I think, unjustly accused of being obnoxiously aggressive. I get the abrasive thing. How many women in the room have had? Yes, every professional woman I know. So the abrasive thing is, if for the men who haven't had the pleasure of the abrasive thing, here's what the abrasive thing is. The abrasive thing is, in order to get a job done, you have to show a certain amount of assertiveness or aggressiveness. And when guys show that, they're rewarded for doing a good job and being appropriately aggressive. And when women do the same thing, they're like, you're too abrasive. You got to back off. And then they can't, if they take that feedback, they can't get their job done. So and often it's not just the abrasive thing. I mean, everybody sometimes is trying to be radically candid and gets unfairly accused of obnoxious aggression. But when that happens to a man, he gets called an asshole. When it happens to a woman, she often gets called a bitch. And again, I don't have data on this, but it's more painful to be called one than the other. Sometimes asshole is even a badge of honor. So here's what happens with women very often is when you get called the B word or when you get the abrasive thing, it's very tempting to back off your challenge. It's very tempting to, in order to get out of this perception of obnoxious aggression, it's very tempting to move over to ruinous empathy or manipulative insincerity. Don't do it. Don't move the wrong direction on the challenge directly dimension. In order to be successful, you must challenge directly. Instead, move up a little bit on the care personally dimension. And by move up on the care personally dimension, I just mean a couple of sentences. I don't mean baking cupcakes for the whole office. Like, it's just, I want to tell you something because I really want to help you. Is now a good time or whatever. You've got to just attend for just a moment to those heightened emotions. Virginia Woolf wrote this amazing essay called The Angel in the House. And it was based on this Victorian poem about how women have no wants or needs of their own. They just exist to serve the men around them, which, of course, Virginia Woolf took great exception to. And she said, the job of a female writer is to kill the angel in the house. Like, don't go that high up on the care personally dimension because it takes you to a bad place. And unfortunately, I think the angel has not been killed. She's just left the house and entered the office all too often. And women get all these kinds of demands of emotional labor get put on women. So don't take all those on. You'll get crushed. You'll get crushed by it. Do take, though, just a minute to move up on the care personally dimension instead of over on in the wrong direction on challenge directly. Does that help a little bit? All right, with that, let's get some drinks and some food. Thank you very much.